Hello, everyone. I want to thank ISCAST and Chris for hosting this wonderful event, and I want to thank all of you for coming here. I don't think this event would be possible if it wasn't for you, so thank you for coming. I also want to say that I'm very proud of the goal of ISCAST as having meaningful conversations with people of different worldviews, different opinions. I think that is a very admirable goal and one that isn't sought in today's society very much. So my talk today is about speaking to atheists about faith and science, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about morality. I believe in objective morality. Most popular atheists do not. Most popular atheists believe in subjective morality because morality has no empirical evidence. And so how can an atheist who rejects God because God has no empirical evidence believe in objective morality, which also has no empirical evidence? The goal of this talk is to help you be able to speak more effectively with atheists, talk their language, and be able to communicate with them in a way that makes sense to them. So in order to do this, I want to talk about the atheist epistemology. The atheist epistemology is grounded in these kinds of claims by Carl Sagan and Laplace. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The weight of evidence for an extraordinary claim must be proportioned to its strangeness. Now, these quotes have been criticized as saying, well, what is extraordinary? Extraordinary isn't really given a clear definition. And so I want to go into the atheist epistemology and give you what do they mean when they say extraordinary. The atheist epistemology consists of three tiers of knowledge: conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical. Conceptual is just stuff in your head. Math, logic, language, intuition, personal testimony, anything that you can imagine, that's conceptual. I am thinking of a unicorn. It's a conceptual unicorn. It's in your head. Empirical is things that exist in the external world independent of your imagination. So if I was to say there is a unicorn outside of this building, independent of my imagination, that would be an empirical unicorn. Now, these two claims have a different standard of evidence from the atheist perspective. If I just claim I'm imagining a unicorn, you would be justified in believing me because it's conceptual. You can imagine a unicorn, and so it's very easy to conceive that I can imagine a unicorn. But if I claim there is a unicorn outside of the building, you would not be justified in believing me purely based off of my say-so. You need something more, something else that's missing from just my testimony. You need like DNA or fur or some physiology that shows that unicorns exist independent of my testimony, and that which my testimony can then bolster to justify I believe it. The last tier is metaphysical. Metaphysics is the fundamental nature of reality. This is a tier I'm not really going to go into in this talk, but essentially it's claims of absolute certainty. The only one that I really know of is I can't believe I exist and be wrong, or cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. So I'm going to give you a quick heuristic in order to gauge how to make claims that make sense to atheists. Conceptual claims require conceptual evidence, empirical claims require empirical evidence, and metaphysical claims require metaphysical evidence. An extraordinary claim is a claim where you're using evidence from one tier to justify a conclusion of a different tier. That would be an extraordinary claim from an atheist perspective. So I want to give a core difference between the atheist and theist perspective. It's testimony. In the theist worldview, testimony is very important. Eyewitness testimony, personal testimony, historical testimony. These are some of the core features that justify belief in a God. Jesus' resurrection, the apostles' testimony, eyewitness testimony of personal experiences of God and miracles. These are very core features of belief in a God. But to atheists, they count as nothing. Essentially equivalent to saying, I imagined I saw Jesus rose from the dead, or I imagined I saw a miracle, with no epistemic difference between the testimony of a visual claim and an imaginary claim. So here's an example. If I told you I saw a dog, it's reasonable to believe that I saw a dog because there's lots of independent empirical evidence of dogs, DNA, physiology, bones, training schedules. But if I told you I saw a unicorn, that would be unreasonable to believe because there is no background empirical evidence of unicorns. The same thing would apply to testimony. If I told you I saw Abraham Lincoln in the 1800s, or Abraham Lincoln was a president in the 1800s, that would be reasonable to believe because Abraham Lincoln is a human. He's made of bones and cells and things that we've already have lots of empirical evidence exists. So it would be reasonable to believe that Abraham Lincoln exists from historical testimony. But if I told you a magic, someone used Avada Kedavra from Harry Potter in the 1300s, it would be unreasonable to believe that purely based off of historical testimony until empirical evidence was provided to demonstrate magic exists. So because Lincoln and historical figures are made of parts that are empirical, bones, cells, matter, energy, it's reasonable to believe the historical testimony of they existed, whereas in cases where there lacks any empirical basis, like magic, it is unreasonable to believe they exist purely based off of testimony. Therefore, testimony is only a conceptual evidence in the atheist worldview. It only applies the same as I imagined I saw, rather than empirical in the sense that it's like scientific, novel, testable predictions. And it cannot justify claims of things actually existing independent of our imagination unless it already has that background of empirical evidence. So this would be miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, or supernatural. So any of these things that testimony alone would not justify unless you have a background information of other kinds of empirical evidence to show they exist prior to the testimony. And this applies even in the cases where there's tons and tons of witnesses, or there's corroborating accounts, or even when you see and touch dead loved ones. All of these things are still forms of testimony that only apply as conceptual evidence. I imagined this happened, rather than it being evidence that the event actually happened independent of our imagination. The reason for this is that there are a lot of psychological phenomena that have been demonstrated empirically that can explain all of these. So folie à deux is an example of multiple people having the exact same delusion. That is a thing. It is actually relatively common. It's pretty rare overall of the types of delusions, but it's a thing we know empirically happens. So we know people can have the same delusion, and that is not a super rare uncommon event. It happens in human society all the time. Second is communal reinforcement. We know that many people can have an experience, and then after they have this experience that they can't initially explain, via talking about it with one another, they can come up with a cohesive story about what that was, and then sync all of their stories together to make it fit. And one common example is UFOs. People see a shining light in the sky, they don't know what it is, and they're talking with everyone around like, oh, it was a UFO, it must have been an alien, and they all can come to the same story, which is like corroborating reports, but that wouldn't actually be evidence of aliens, because this is a common feature of human psychology that when they see something they don't know and they come together and talk about it, they just build the same story. And the last one is bereavement delusion. Bereavement delusion is an extremely common phenomenon where people will see, touch, hear dead loved ones after they die. And so these psychological phenomena we know about make it very difficult for testimony to be credible, because testimony on its own can't differentiate imagination from reality. And that's the core feature of the atheist epistemology, is that when we talk about evidence, we want empirical evidence that has been demonstrated to be able to differentiate imagination from reality. So, a common response to this is, well, atheists are just too strict. They're just dismissing a whole class of evidence without any justification. And so I want to talk to you that is not necessarily true. There's a lot of basis for the same thing in other fields that also use testimony as a core basis, such as law and history. In the legal and history settings, academically, the consensus applies very similar principles that you can find in those fields. For example, in law, here is a bunch of court cases that actually happened that involved ghosts, miracles, magic, supernatural, all these kind of things. And each of these cases, the testimony involving miracles, magic, mythical creatures, all lack legal precedence because none of those things have been empirically demonstrated to exist, and these cases constantly get dismissed for that reason. So even in law, testimony of things that lack an empirical basis is not accepted as evidence that those things are true. In history, this is a quote from Michael Lacona's paper, Historians and Miracle Claims. Just to be clear, Michael Lacona is a Christian, and in this paper he's arguing that this should not be the case. He's trying to argue that you should accept miracle claims in history. But the very first line of his paper, most biblical scholars and historians hold that the investigation of a miracle report lies outside of the rights of historians acting within their professional capacity. This is the consensus among the majority of historians, that claims of miracles, magic, mythical creatures in history is not justifiable via the study methods of the methodology of historians. In order to justify things in historical claims, there needs to already be a pre-existing empirical basis that those things exist prior to being able to believe they exist based off of testimony, historical testimony. Now, to be clear, there's lots of other standards as well. Like if someone claimed that there was a mammoth in their backyard in the 1400s, you wouldn't believe that. But because it at least has an empirical basis, it would be more plausible than one that had no empirical basis, like a magical creature. So the core difference in this case is that because there's no empirical basis, it's unreasonable to believe claims of things that are true independent of your imagination. So in the case of morality, which is based on moral intuition, moral progress, philosophical arguments, and moral dilemmas, which are all forms of conceptual evidence, how can I make a reasonable argument for objective morality which does not have any of these empirical evidence? The trick is, if you have a claim of evidence for your model of morality and assert that it is true independent of your imagination, you are making an empirical claim. You're saying this thing is true independent of my imagination, which requires empirical evidence to justify from the atheist perspective. So if such evidence is lacking, and you make this claim, it's going to appear inconsistent or irrational to an atheist audience, potentially undermining your argument. To avoid this, it's more effective to acknowledge that you don't have any evidence. When I'm talking about morality, I'm saying I don't have any empirical evidence. It doesn't exist. And when I do this, it limits the model to, instead of being an empirical claim about what exists independent of my imagination, it's a conceptual claim. It's a hypothesis. I'm saying here's the hypothesis I have. I'm not actually claiming it exists yet, or that there's any evidence yet, but I can use this to say, shift the conversation away from conversations about what qualifies as real evidence to conversations about what is the data. What data am I using to build my hypothesis? And this is the much more productive conversation than debates about, oh no, that's not real evidence. And the atheists will take this much more seriously. They'll be listening to, oh, because this is more of a conceptual, hypothetical conversation, they're much more willing to engage with the data that I used, rather than initially dismissing it because it's unreasonable to claim you have evidence for something that has no empirical basis. By admitting that you have no empirical evidence, you're categorizing your claim as conceptual rather than empirical. This acknowledgement shifts the discussion from the debate from epistemic inconsistencies to a more open dialogue about patterns and reasoning that you use to form your hypothesis. So in conclusion, when I'm talking about morality, first thing I do is I acknowledge my limitations. I say that my model doesn't have any empirical evidence, just a hypothesis. I present my reasoning, I present the data I use, the patterns in moral intuition, moral progress, philosophical dilemmas, and moral distinctions. And then I offer testable predictions. I say, from this model that I've built, here's some testable predictions about the future that we don't know yet, and if I get them right, that would be empirical evidence. This approach resonates with the atheist and naturalist audience, and it aligns with the methodology of forming hypotheses based on observed patterns and testing them empirically. It also reframes the discussion from debating evidence to evaluating the reasons and patterns behind the hypothesis.
That was short, sharp, and punchy. How much of what you're saying do you think rests on the very, very particular nature of the way you're using the word evidence? So, the contrast between evidence and having reasons for something. You presumably are saying roughly, you don't have evidence for objective morality, but you have reasons for believing in objective morality.
Right. So when you use the term evidence from an atheist audience perspective, by evidence they want empirical evidence. If it's not empirical, it's not evidence. It doesn't even count. And so when I'm using evidence in this context in order to match the atheist audience's understanding of the word, I'm limiting it to refer to empirical things, meaning things that can differentiate imagination from reality. The other kinds of conceptual evidence, logic, philosophical arguments, etc., I wouldn't call that evidence when talking to an atheist audience because it would create an internal inconsistency with what they expect.
So rule number one, don't bother getting into an argument talking about the meaning of the word evidence. Just don't use it.
Yes, correct.
Rule number two, drop old-time apologetics, which is, I'm going to offer you the evidence for Christianity and then you'll believe me.
Right.
Okay.
They would actually like that because they go, oh, you have empirical evidence? Let's go.
Yeah. Okay. Don't fall into that trap.
Yep.
Great. Well, we're going to have a few questions here. I'm looking forward to it. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4.
Don't worry about it. Just go for it because Ant's up the back here working for you.
Oh, yeah. So on this question of evidence, you say, I've actually dialogued with a lot of atheists online. I've encountered the same phenomenon where they demand empirical evidence. All they want is the empirical evidence. But this seems to me that it's just logical positivism all over again, which is a philosophical movement which has been dead for about 80 years. And the whole impetus of that movement was that evidence and claims can only be meaningful if they're empirical. But philosophy's moved on from that. That's an old conversation. Logical positivism died in the water. So if atheists just demand empirical evidence, couldn't we just say that, well, logical positivism is dead and atheists need a philosophical education to bring them up to the 21st century? Look, I'm sorry if that sounds pejorative, but, you came to a Christian conference, so...
Yes. So that is actually one of so that is one of the most common claims when responding to atheists, and it kind of misses the mark. So positivism, logical positivism, is the claim that the only kind of evidence is empirical evidence. Which, of course, that statement, if I say the only kind of evidence is empirical evidence, well, how do you justify that claim with empirical evidence? You can't. It's contradictory. But that's not the atheist claim. Atheists acknowledge there are other kinds of evidence. What the question is what is evidence for? So they acknowledge 1 + 1 = 2, that's conceptual, it's logic, but it isn't evidence for something in the external world. It's not evidence of unicorns. And so you can have conceptual evidence, which would violate logical positivism. And so the atheist epistemology isn't positivism, because it's granting there are other kinds of evidence, but it's limiting what that evidence can be used to apply to. And so saying it's logical positivism will miss the mark in trying to address their position. Now, they don't know this, they don't know the intricacies of logical positivism or empiricism, but in essence, the best way to address that is not to call them positivists, but say, well, do you acknowledge that logic can be evidence of, or math can be evidence of conceptual conclusions? And if they do, well, they're not logical positivists.
So you mentioned that your arguments for objective morality, but you didn't comment, and probably not relevant, but there must be, that objective morality must have some concrete moral standards, which suggests that they're objective through time. So are there examples of, in your, at least your objective morality that you think apply at all times and aren't socially contingent?
Yes, sure. So I didn't go into my morality at all, but I will definitely be happy to give an overview. So my morality, what I do is I start with the evidence. There's lots of patterns in moral intuition and moral progress. To give a quick example, if a doctor in the 1800s cuts your leg off because your leg was shot and he's trying to save your life, he's justified to cut your leg off because it's the best he can do to try to save your life. But if a modern doctor cuts your leg off to try to save your life, you're going to sue him for malpractice because he has antibacterials, antibiotics. He can save your life without cutting your leg off. The pattern there is that as you have more power to solve a problem by causing less harm, you're obligated to do the less harm. So a doctor in the 1800s has very little power, so he's justified in causing a lot of harm. A modern doctor has a lot of power, so he's justified in causing little harm. And this pattern can be continued. It's a big, long graph. There's lots of examples you can use. And if we continue this pattern to the end, we can say if you have infinite power, you're not justified in causing any harm, because it's all unnecessary. And so there's many patterns like this we can use in lots of different philosophical distinctions, but to me it leads to the conclusion that the ultimate moral principle is any involuntary imposition of will is immoral, or forcing people to do things they don't consent to doing is immoral. That, I think, is the ultimate moral principle that we can build everything off of. And my morality consists of a perfect moral world would look like a world where it's impossible to force anyone to do anything they don't consent to doing. Everybody starts with their own world that they can design however they want, and it's immoral to create any conscious agent that doesn't have adult-level ability to consent. So, like, no children, no people with mental handicaps. And I believe this is a description of a physical law. So I think morality is a physical law of the universe, just like gravity, and it exists in the same way that it permeates the universe throughout time. So it's unchanging. It does apply through all time because fields like quantum fields can exist outside of space-time.
Now, who's number three? Number three?
Thanks, Tom. It was beautiful. I really appreciate your the clarity and charity of the way you expressed it. I'm going to respond, and I would like a response from my response, but I haven't got a direct question.
Gotcha.
I'm an advocate of science and religion conflict, which is going to be very heretical in this room. But I think you give exactly the reason why we need it. I've spent all my academic life in the secular academy, so I've never been in the seminary. As a sociologist, I'm the only guy in the room who believes in God when we talk about religion. I'm very used to what I would call methodological atheism in the procedures of our knowledge constructs. And I'm totally familiar with it, and I've never tried to persuade anyone about God through methodological atheism, because the method itself will get you to a position where there's no point in talking about it, right?
Sure.
So what you've done makes perfect sense in the context in which I operate academically. So what you do, you separate conceptual from evidentialism.
Empirical. Conceptual, empirical, and metaphysical.
And metaphysical, right? So this disintegration of categories is exactly the problem for me, right? So it will be this beautiful little book by Lloyd P. Gerson, who's a classicist in Canada, called Ancient Epistemology. And there is no such thing as epistemology until the 19th century. So ontology is the ground of knowledge. So metaphysics is the basis of evidence and conception in classical thinking. And to me, it's a completely different way of thinking. So if I'm starting from theological premises, they are metaphysical. And then I'm going to think about what evidence is and what conceptual knowledge is on the basis of that foundation. And what we have now is that Christians are trying to think like methodological atheists and getting incredibly confused. And I'm never going to persuade an atheist that he's wrong on those grounds. So a bit like your friend in, was it Pennsylvania, the Phileas?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you can't...
Pete Inns, in case anyone doesn't know.
Right. So if you can't sort of see a revelation, there's nothing I can talk about. So it strikes me as really fascinating that modern thinking tends to be disintegrating in categories and isolating of metaphysics, and I can't really chopping metaphysics off. And therefore there's no point in thinking about a Christian relationship to modern science. So when you're sorry, heresy. so we need to kind of, I think Christians need to rethink a basis of approaching natural philosophy that is metaphysically and theologically grounded, and it won't look like science, and it won't talk the same language that you're talking about. We're trying to talk your language, and we'll always lose if we do. Can you give me a response?
Yes, so from the atheist perspective, metaphysics is a category that we really shouldn't talk about, because what we should start with isn't what we think we know about the fundamental nature of reality. Metaphysics is the fundamental first principles of reality. We shouldn't start with those, because we don't. We start with our consciousness. I think therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. So the first thing you should start with is, well, how do I tell the difference between my imagination and what exists, or what apparently exists? And then after you get a good grounds of that, you can try to move to questions of metaphysics. But starting with metaphysics is begging the question. You're saying, well, I'm just going to skip to what the fundamental nature of reality is, and then work backwards to get to my consciousness, which doesn't make sense from the atheist perspective, until you first have a way to differentiate imagination from reality. Because if you can't do that, you're just essentially begging the question and saying, well, I'm just going to imagine this is true, and just start with that, and then work backwards, and the atheist is going to think that's nonsense.
I was also going to ask about your conception of morality. I don't know, you kind of half answered my question, so I'm going to try and reframe it. But I'm interested in your understanding of, you said you don't have empirical evidence for your understanding of morality, and I have quite a few atheist friends, including both of my roommates, and whenever we have discussions, we kind of get to a point where they concede the point that, okay, I don't believe in objective morality because I don't believe in any sort of God or external being or something. So, but from the way you described it, it sounds like you think of morality as more like a fundamental force of the universe akin to physics. But how do you get there?
Sure. So the definition of objective is just stance-independent truth. Subjective is stance-dependent truth. So in order to have an objective basis for something, all you need is it needs to be true, independent of opinion, independent of a stance. And so there are many different models of objective morality. It may come as a surprise to you that most academic philosophers are atheists, and most academic philosophers believe in moral realism, objective morality. There's a poll, the Phil Survey's paper, the largest poll of academic philosophers. They've done it in the 2020 and 2022. Both have concluded the same thing. Most are atheists. Most believe in objective morality. So objective morality is anything that grounds the truth of morality that's just true, independent of opinion. So it can be like Platonic objects, a priori abstracts, the natural laws, moral realism. There's a ton of different models that can ground objective morality. My hypothesis is that it's a law of physics, because laws of physics seems to be the best candidate for the ground of everything. It seems they can be outside of space-time, quantum fields. We know they exist from the Casimir effect. They seem to be a much more plausible explanation for what we want as fundamental things. If we're arguing for what's the best candidate for a fundamental thing, laws of physics seem to be the best candidate. How do I get there? I look at patterns in moral intuition and moral progress and the moral dilemmas across time, and I say that, I draw the line graph, and I say, well, this leads to the conclusion of these principles, and I say, if I'm right, what would I expect to see? If I'm right that there's some law of physics that is governing and causing this consistent change and pattern across species, well, then we should see it if we meet aliens. If we meet aliens, they should still be on the same spectrum and still following this pattern. And that would be good empirical evidence that whatever is causing morality isn't a social construct. Because if it was just a social construct of humans, then why would we wouldn't expect to see it in aliens. And if my pattern is correct, then AI, if it gets developed, would also follow the same pattern of morality. If that was the case, then that would mean it's not an evolutionary byproduct unless AI evolves, which wouldn't necessarily need to. And so we can start to eliminate the social constructionist ideas that it's a societal construct, an evolutionary construct, a human construct, by seeing the same pattern outside of the social norms of these societies. And if we do see this pattern across the universe, say we could just go to all the planets and we all see this pattern, it's rational to conclude that what's causing this pattern is some centralizing force such as the law of physics that permeates all the planets.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to change tack, but just to comment on that last bit you did, to me it sounds very close to where some of the theological thinkers around natural law end up. But I want to change tack, and I want to ask, in working for a common good, how do you see persons of faith and atheists working together? How do we do that towards some sort of common good in society?
Well, I think we do that automatically. I think that because of the patterns in moral intuition and moral progress we see in society, everybody's getting better. This might be something that many Christians disagree with. The evidence I see shows that the world as a whole and humanity as a whole are becoming more moral in every society, religious societies, secular societies, everybody. And because we can look at patterns of how, like, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, anti-slavery, workers' rights, animal rights, we can even have like all kinds of movements towards individual rights that weren't there in the past. So it seems like in every society, regardless of what your religious beliefs are, as we gain more power, we tend to value more individual rights. And so we can work together even without realizing it, just because we are affected societally by this progress of moral intuition. And if you want to work together with atheists, you can just say, hey, we both think things should be better, let's work together and do it. So like one of my personal goals, I think that church provides a phenomenal resource for social connectivity, assisted living, a whole bunch of different aspects that are missing in the secular community. And I think that we can learn from one another and work together to create institutions that are successful like churches, and acknowledge that, so the Christian society is doing the church thing way better than we are, we should learn from them, and then ask for help from the Christian society about how do we do this. Likewise, you can look at secular societies like the Finland, Norway, not Iceland. Iceland is mostly Christian, but many of the secular societies, and say, well, what are they doing correctly? What are they doing better? Like Finland has the best education system in the world. And we can say, well, we should probably adopt those policies. So I think that the best way is to acknowledge that people with different worldviews can be doing things better, and we should ask them for help of how we can do it too.
Hi, Tom.
Hey.
Thank you very much. A question on objective morality as a law of physics. My understanding of the philosophy of science is that physics describes what is. Morality is about what we ought to do, or what ought to be. And as David Hume famously said, you cannot get an ought from an is. How do you make that jump?
Oh, absolutely. So the argument that oughts are inherent in morality entails this idea that oughtness is like in morality somewhere. So I would ask the question, is something good because you ought to do it? Or ought you do it because it's good? What would be your intuitive answer to that, former or latter?
My answer would be both of those options involve oughts, which don't exist in physics.
But there is a point to this question. So is something good because you ought to do it? Or ought you do something because it's good?
I could give you a Christian answer to that, which is that goodness is the nature of God. We are created in the image of God. We fail. We fail to hit the mark when we fail to be the image of God. Therefore, every time we fulfill what is good in the world, we are fulfilling our goal, our telos, our reason for existing.
What is a more specific question? Like it's A or B kind of a thing. Is something good?
But I'm allowed to reject your question as being wrong.
Well, it's neither right or wrong. It's like saying...
No, questions can be wrong. is that podium a horse or the number 3? That's a wrong question.
But it's like saying, does water exist or does it not exist? It's a true dichotomy. So the goal is, it's
But
not...
you're talking about physical existence, and that's my whole point. You're
Yes.
trying to squeeze the juice of morality, which is not a physical thing, out of the science of physics, which has nothing to do with anything except the physical.
Well, that's what the point of this question is to illustrate, is if you say something is good because you ought to do it, that doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't seem like the oughtness is what makes it good. That doesn't seem to make sense. And so it seems more like you ought to do something because it's good. And if that's the case, if you ought to do something because it's good, that means oughtness isn't required for morality. It's just not. If you ought to do something because it's good independently of the oughtness is a byproduct. It's not moral. And I think that's the case. It seems like there is something that is good, and we ought to do something because it's good. It's not that something is good because you ought to do it. So if you just think of circles, if you think that goodness is a circle and oughtness is in the circle, then something is good because you ought to do it. It's a property of goodness. But if you think there's the circle of goodness and oughtness is outside the circle, then you can say we ought to do something because it's good. And so this argument is meant to demonstrate whether oughtness is an intrinsic part of goodness or external to goodness. And if it is the case that oughtness is external to goodness, that answers your question. We don't need the oughtness. Should we get another chair, start a debate?
I will stop at the end and let you have the last word. But where is goodness in physics? I can give you a textbook of physics. I promise you there is no goodness in there in any of the equations whatsoever. It is simply not what physics deals with. Physics neutrally describes what is. Forget about oughtness. I deny there is goodness in physics.
Sure.
Unless you're a Christian and you believe that God's creation is intrinsically good. And you don't have that option available to you.
Well, so that argument was actually similarly made against Einstein when the philosophers famously said, time doesn't bend. Time is a philosophical concept. Time can't bend. By definition, time is philosophical. It doesn't exist. It can't bend. That is silly. And then Einstein said, I got testable predictions. You're wrong. So the fact that we currently define a concept based off of what relates to us intuitively doesn't mean it relates to what the thing is in reality. So if I think goodness is... There's this pattern of goodness that we see in the universe. Ultimately, goodness is whatever is creating that pattern. If that pattern is societal constructions, then it's just a social construct. If that pattern is caused by a God's dictates, then a God's dictates is causing the pattern of morality. If that pattern is caused by a law of physics, morality is the law of physics. If we have a phenomenon, and we define that phenomenon with language, so like we see planets going around the sun, we say that's the curvature of space-time, and we can make predictions that confirm that, to demonstrate that phenomenon is causing the things we see. And that is evidence that whatever your hypothesis is correct. So even though we can come up with a definition that time can't bend, if someone else can say, no, I think time is actually this physical concept in the world, and they can use it to make predictions to explain the phenomenon of time, and they get it right, your preconceived definitions aren't really relevant anymore. We just don't care. Physics and reality are not constrained by our conceptual definitions, our philosophical armchair definitions.
I think we're going to move on from that one. We could go into a lot more discussion about whether certain ways of putting it are straw men and whether certain parallels are the right parallels. But we're here to hear Tom's advice about how to connect with an atheist. I'm going to get to you next, Stephen, about how to connect, how to have a conversation with an atheist. So, Tom, I've got a question for you. If you're a Christian and you're speaking to your average or maybe fairly thoughtful atheist like yourself, are you allowed to ask a question like this? And if so, how would you answer it? What would convince you that there was a God, that the Christian story was roughly objectively true?
Okay, so it's easy. Novel testable predictions. The standard for evidence for pretty much most of the materialist, naturalist worldview is novel testable predictions. As I mentioned before, when atheists use the word evidence, what they mean is they want a way to differentiate imagination from reality. And if you can do that, that's evidence. And currently the best way to how to do that is novel, testable prediction. So if you say, when you die, you're going to go to heaven and see God, that would be evidence of Christianity. I would be like, okay, this is good evidence. Christianity may be true. So another example would be like, since Jesus predicted he would die and rise again in 3 days, that would be evidence if it actually happens. Of course, I don't believe there's evidence it did, but that would be evidence. So prophecy would be another example. In Revelation, there's lots of predictions of things that may happen. If you could make testable predictions in the same way that science does, that would be phenomenal evidence. Like my favorite example is if the Bible said DNA is a double helix, the universe is 13.8 billion years old, Donald Trump is the president. Like if it said those things, those would be great evidence. And actually the best evidence of this comes from Hinduism. Hinduism predicts the age of the earth with 95% accuracy, written 6,000 years ago. That is the best prediction I've ever seen in any religious document.
Back to the Christian question then. So hypothetically, there could be a God, but that God isn't bowing to your demands of the sort of evidence that you would like. And therefore, your claim or your atheist claim that however you state your atheist claim, that's because hypothetically, if there is a God, that God isn't giving you what you want in terms of evidence, roughly.
Well, I would phrase it differently, because I believe the correct way to phrase the atheist epistemology is how do you differentiate imagination from reality? And if God is not giving us a way to differentiate himself from imagination, then we should probably conclude he's imaginary. It seems like in any case, if there is no way to differentiate if this is an imaginary thing that only exists in our mind, as opposed to a real thing that exists in the apparent world, we should probably conclude it's imaginary.
Thank you.
So,
Tom, thank you very much for vigour and clarity. I spent 20 years lecturing in something called God and Natural Sciences at the University of Melbourne, co-designed with my atheist colleagues from History and Philosophy of Science, with 60% of the students being atheists and agnostics. So I was inevitably drawn into conversing with atheists, right? Including my two colleagues especially.
My condolences.
Right, so well done. So there were a number of examples of the conversation. I'm not going to go into the detail, but just to indicate. One was the problem of natural evil, all the terrible sufferings produced by natural processes that God has supposedly created, seems to contradict perfectly good or powerful. So that was one conversation. Another was prophecies that appear to be fulfilled. For example, Jeremiah and both the destruction of Jerusalem and the return from exile, and a discussion about that. Another one was, which is, I wrote up in an article in the ISCAS journal called From Physics to Metaphysics, A New Way. The way that argument worked, I think it will meet many of your requirements, but it's worth, I might just say a little bit about that one.
just a little bit, Steve.
Just a little bit, yes. It's only a little bit. I think this is only my second conversation in the whole 3 or 4 days, but look, it'll only be a little bit.
No, I'm sorry. Time does not accrue.
It's okay, time bends, we're fine.
It's a joke. It's a joke. It's only a joke. But the thing was, the two starting points. One was from Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox, the BBC fan, who's claimed that questions like why are we here and why is there anything at all are scientific questions. This is immediately refutable because if it's a scientific question, there's going to be drawing on something about the universe, and that means you will, in principle, logically, be unable to answer the question, why is there anything at all? Right, so we get rid of him. So, on the other hand, he was emphatic that in this vast universe, here we are on a speck of a planet, and we know so much about the universe, and we're going to find out so much more, and isn't scientific inquiry amazing? Which I entirely agree. It's so amazing that it invites the speculation. And I think I'm using the terms rightly here. A speculation that all, as everything, the universe is intelligible, right? And scientific inquiry has rendered it so, and it will continue
right? And the gaps will close, etc., etc. So, now I'm wanting to make a shift from physics to metaphysics. And so one of the moves there is to say, and it's going to be short, right? So if the world is supposedly intelligible, I'd like fully intelligible. I think no missing. I'd like answers to the questions: why is there anything at all, and why is it structured the way it is? And then why is there anything at all is an old philosophical theme. You only get an infinite regress, or you get a statement that the answer is no answer, because it's just a brute fact, right? So if you're wanting an answer to the question why is there anything at all, it has to be in terms of something that exists necessarily. So that's a long and old tradition, discounted of the last century and more, because of science seems to render it so on. But that's still an old question and an answer. The other one, why is the universe structured and structured the way it is, can only be answered if you have some idea of how the universe is structured. So otherwise you don't have anything to discuss. So along with you, I took in the paper that's in the journal, I took the view that a proper way to answer the question, temporarily at least, is it's structured according to the laws of physics. And the person that I used to give us an answer, to tell me about the laws of physics, was Victor Stenger, very well-known atheist, right? Who was able to derive all of the laws of physics, right, from two premises. One was the ordinary physical knowledge, which doesn't, like the fact that there are electric fields and magnetic fields, but no law about them. And the other thing was his assumption that what physicists are trying to do is that what they're aiming at is objective knowledge. Right? That is, it's not dependent, what I know is not dependent on my relationship to it. Whatever it is independently of me, and my knowing has to be objective. And from those two premises, he was able to derive all of the mathematical laws of physics. Right? It's in his book, Comprehensible Cosmos. It does the derivations. The mathematics is there in appendices A to G, so you can see it all. Now, I think I'm nearly done here.
I think you are still.
Right, no, this is good. This is good. So there we are, a lovely bit of work from my point of view. Now, where does the issue? The issue comes as this, that taking what he said, it means that the laws of physics, which are operative, of course, from this instance after the Big Bang up until and long beyond, are derivable from something that only appears billions of years later. Right? Objective scientific inquiry. And this looks very odd. It looks like it's calling out for explanation. A naturalistic response would say, not at all. Not at all. We will handle that like we always handle naturalistic questions, and that is, we will show that your apparently odd result is not odd because we will give a completely naturalistic account of it. Huh? And then, I'm not going to go into the detail. The attempt to do that, it logically fails. And then the question is, how might you explain it? And it turns out that the opening move, why is there anything at all, and the traditional answer to that, can now be deployed here. So,
well, it's actually quite easy to answer. So,
I should say that Stephen and I go way back, so you know.
Yes.
If you think I was being rude to him,
You were being rude.
go ahead, Tom.
yeah, so the first question, why is there something? It's very, very easy to answer this question. Why is there God? It's a necessary being. So we can just use the exact same answer and say, well, why is there the quantum fields? It's a necessary being. Problem solved. A necessary being in philosophy is a being that exists in all logically possible worlds. That's the definition of a necessary being. A brute fact is a fact that exists with no prior explanation. So you can have brute necessities. Very, very common fact in philosophy. Graham Opie argues this quite successfully. So we can just say there is a brute fact, either God exists or the quantum field exists. Both of those would be brute facts, and they would both be brute necessities, and they'd be epistemically equivalent. And so if you want to say, well, why is there God? And you say it's because it's necessary. Well, the exact same answer works for why is there a quantum field. is necessary. And there's no evidential way you could justify that one is less plausible than the other. They can both exist outside of space-time. They can both have divine aseity, where they're just singular properties, because none of those things have any empirical evidence to differentiate which actually has this property and which is just being asserted to have this property. They're just both assertions. So that one's easy. The next one is why is...
I'm not sure that the theologians would say it's easy to compare the necessity of God and the necessity of the quantum field. But carry on.
I have had about 1,000 debates on this, and they tend to not find a flaw with the argument. So we can do a debate on that next time.
Well,
But yeah, so the next
Wait a what I think we need to do either now or in a minute.
well, excuse me, I'll just tell people where we're up to, Stephen.
What?
We did allow until 3:30 for this session. So if you're thinking this is going on a long time, the program does get till 3:30, and that's why we're continuing. So, yeah.
Just to briefly address your second question of why is the universe the way it is, Victor Singer himself did not derive the laws of physics as they are from the first principles. What he said was, from first principles, you can get a variety of laws of physics. He was actually addressing the fine-tuning argument when he said this, and he compared it to a set of dice. The way the current set of laws could be a result of the fact that there are a number of ways it could be, and there's some probability that it would assess or accumulate in this way as opposed to another way because of an unknown law that entangles the other laws and that could increase the probability of any given set. So the current set we have could actually be defined or determined by another unknown law that we haven't discovered yet, which actually make this set extremely common. And you can go further than that and say that this set of laws is necessary and was determined because all of the laws are interconnected by, say, the fine structure constant, like an Hoberman sphere. Once you pull on any corner, they all expand equivalently. That would determine the laws of physics to have exactly this proportional alignment, and you can do that without any reference to a God, purely by an unknown law that determines or entangles all of them. So actually, that is also, again, a very simple question to answer. The one that you did want to talk about was prophecy. Prophecy is not my expertise because I don't read Greek or Hebrew, but Bart Ehrman does and many historians do, and their argument is that in Hebrew and Greek, those words in Aramaic, those words have many, many different usages. They're not like English today where there's a very select few, like a primary and then a secondary. They have a whole bunch of different interpretations. So when assessing the prophecies in the Bible, most of them are just simply too vague to actually count as real prophecies by the accounts of the actual historians do the translation from the original documents. And it seems like most of the monks picked the interpretation that fit best the narrative. So it wasn't really a prophecy as much as it was a broad statement that could be applied in a lot of ways. And the monks later in the 1400s interpreted it to make it look like a prophecy.
I think that the textual scholars amongst us, and I'm not one of them, but I do have this very thick book on my desk called BADG. The textual scholars will say probably we've done a lot of work on working out how biblical words were used at the time. But moving on, does anyone have another question to the point? And the point is, Tom's here very kindly to help us think about how to communicate well with atheists. And I think he's given us a few clues. Ian?
So, Tom, from my hearing of your talk and your conversation, it might be broad brushed, but I would say you are more like an old style philosopher or liberal, not a post-truth person in 2024. And so if we sat down over a coffee, we could have a great conversation with all sorts of philosophical questions, and I would really enjoy that. I do find that with my children's generation, they would say something like, I think Christianity is true because it is real, as opposed to I think it is real because it is true, which we would have done in the 1980s when I was at university. So I'm gathering that you may have problems talking to that generation as well, thinking a post-truth world where everyone has their own truth. And words are just power structures that can be redefined to mean anything. And I'm wondering, is that something you see you have in common with us that we can both work on together and hopefully benefit the world? And how would you propose that we speak to atheists who have that sort of post-truth mindset?
Oh yes, absolutely. So I'm definitely not a postmodernist. I think truth is objective. Truth is that which corresponds to reality. And I think that the postmodernist view can actually be addressed in the evidence models that I presented earlier. You have conceptual, empirical, metaphysical. In the postmodernist view, truth is conceptual. It's in our imagination. And so if you can understand that and frame your language in such a way that you are referring to conceptual principles and conceptual evidence, you can actually have a very effective communication with them. And then you just need to be able to separate in the conversation that it is specifically referring to conceptual truth and that there are other kinds of truth. So that is the difference, is that when you end up fighting with the definition of truth with people who are postmodernists, and they're using it in a broad spectrum of ways. We're using it in a very specific way to refer to reality. And if you can understand the different usages of truth and find a way to navigate between which one you're using in any given sentence, you can have a very productive conversation with them.
I think we're winding up. Thank you.
We've been very distracted in this session about questions of what is physically or philosophically true. And a lot of the reading that I've been doing recently suggests that we as humans actually value that a lot less than we think we do. We have our preconceived notions, and we then use rational arguments to justify them rather than the other way around. I'm thinking particularly of Jonathan Haidt, who I read recently. So my question is, how can we move beyond the very appealing and distracting and, to be fair, necessary squabble about what is truth, what is objective truth, and move into the space of, how can we share lives together? How can I come into your space? How can you come into mine? How can we actually start to share in each other's experiences of lived reality?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So that is goes back to my original statement that if you claim you have evidence, that word has emotional value to atheists. It means a lot to them. They want differentiate imagination from reality. And because there's an emotional connection to that word, regardless of the truth of the word, it's a word, it doesn't have a truth, it's just a definition. We can make up whatever definition we want, but because it has emotional significance, you're going to have to address the concerns that they have relative to their emotional connection to it. And that's what you were talking about, is that truth matters less to us than the emotional connection, the confirmation bias we use to try to get to our truth. And so the better way to have a conversation is to not trample over the things that have that emotional significance. So instead of saying you have evidence, and using a word that is emotionally charged to atheists, you can say, I have a hypothesis. I don't have any evidence. It's just, here's the data I use. And because that isn't triggering their emotional response to the word evidence, they are much more willing to have a comfortable, happy conversation about the data points. And so I think that understanding what the things that have the most emotional significance to another party and avoiding those things and phrasing it in a more comfortable way from their perspective will allow you to have more meaningful lives together, conversations together, and function better.
May we all have more meaningful lives together and encourage one another. That wasn't quite a prayer, but almost.
Amen.
Please take time.